a minute, try and get some folks in here. Everybody's out doing, I guess, what I charged them to do, which is network. And all right, I'm going to go gather some folks here.
You're perfect. All right, good.
Kicking you out, Eddie, apparently. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. How are we doing?
Thank you.
Good. So, before we get formally started, Brenda Thompson from Vernon Oaks is also here. And I wanted to have the opportunity to recognize her and as well as present the award to her. I think you heard about Vernon Oaks as a property management firm and their intention, but Brenda, thank you for being here, and your award is right here. Holly, let's take a quick picture. Sure. Congratulations. Let's give her a round of applause. We think it's particularly important to recognize folks who are doing the hard work every day. And so that's why we take the time to make sure we're acknowledging those folks, particularly in this area of affordable housing. So I'm going to say good morning again. We're now streaming, so for the benefit of the audience as well, you may hear a couple things that sound similar, but good morning. My name is Brian Argrett. I am the President and CEO of City First Bank of DC, and also the chairman of City First Foundation, which is our host today. We are very, very proud today to be presenting the second of 3 impact forums this year. This one is focused on affordable housing, something that's critically important in our city and critically important to you, I know, but also to City First. And the way these events work, we really are bringing together frontline change makers, folks who are doing the work and executing and interested. And the idea here is we bring them together, we'll share some information, you'll share some experiences. Good morning, Todd. And we'll go from there. And what we hope happens is that you leave more informed, more connected, and more driven to address some of the issues that we face in our city, in this case particularly around affordable housing. As I mentioned earlier, City First specializes in working with both emerging but also established developers, non-profit and for-profit, alongside other change agents, city governments, federal government, to really address. Put it right here, so I'll make sure I would share with you. First of all, you all should now have the agendas that are in the program booklet. That will spare us some of the introductions, but I really, really do encourage you to take a look. You have very accomplished and driven professionals that will be sharing with you today. Secondly, we are also, for each speaker, they'll have their Twitter handle or whatever else they may have given us. And we ask you to please be active on social media. Let people know that this matters to you. And just make sure you also use the hashtag CityFirst, hashtag CityFirst as well, and that will connect it back. Let me tell you a little bit about the flow of the day, so we have a sense of how things will proceed today. We've just finished our Community Builder Awards this morning, and I'm very, very proud and very humbled by the 11 recipients that we have the honor of honoring this morning. Good morning. Secondly, I'm sorry, I see people and I want to go and say hi and talk to them, but I'm supposed to be doing this job, so we'll do that. We'll chat later. Remember what I said, the whole point is to be here to be able to interact with each other. We're then going to do, in just a moment, we have Director Donaldson here, and we're going to do a quick coffee and conversation, as we call it. I don't know that we have coffee. We missed that last time as well, but we got the City First water bottles. Maybe there's something in there. We'll do that with Director Donaldson, and you'll have a chance really to hear from her, maybe in a little different way than you might normally chat with her. Then we're going to have Ed Lazier, who's right here with his camera up, taking photos, social media. And he's going to give us, we always think it's very important to have the discussions rooted in data, to have some background around the severity of the issue or some of the challenges or nuances. And so he's going to provide a housing presentation from the DC Fiscal Policy Institute. Then we'll get to our main event, the main event in the center ring, as they say, and that'll be our panel discussion with Q&A. Then we're going to have the lunch reception, which again is our chance to connect and build those relationships. And then we're actually going to have 3 different breakout sessions in various parts of the building and the gallery right next door, 2 doors down. And we're going to be talking about 3 different topics, and they're very interactive, kind of a small group information and data gathering and discussion. We'll be talking about optimizing opportunity zones. And you may know, but on Friday, the Treasury through the IRS issued the regulations on opportunity zones. So this is a very timely process, the first of several, as Polly and I were just discussing earlier. We're also going to have an open forum, something that matters tremendously right here, and that's the Douglas Community Land Trust. I know we have a number of folks who are here. And then we're also going to talk about public-private partnerships. Nothing in housing really happens without that. I do want to recognize, and it's very important to recognize the sponsors and supporters who help us bring this to you. And I'm going to list them: DCHFA, you see Todd Lee is right there, and the HIP program, the Housing Investment Platform. Very special thanks to the Bernstein Companies, Holland & Knight, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Cone Resnick, SunTrust, US Bank Corp, the CDC, Wells Fargo, Promontory Interfinancial, FIS, and Rapid Scale. And again, on the back of your program, if you want to glance, you will see who believes these issues are important and for you to be engaged in. I'm also just going to quickly mention we have a number of different types of professionals in the room. We have everything from researchers and think tank to practitioners. We have some family foundations who've joined us. We have obviously officials from local and federal government, policymakers, advocates, of which I hope we are all, housing advocates. and then, of course, builders and corporate leaders around affordable housing. And so, again, I would like to thank all of them. So I will welcome all of you and thank you for being here. Someone asked me this morning, and so I'll just mention this, what's the City First Foundation? And it's essentially the educational and outreach arm for City First. It's our opportunity, and our mission is to promote broader understanding, participation around, and effectiveness around community development, around economic justice, and around parity of opportunity, particularly here in the Washington, D.C. region. So let's go ahead and get started, but just before that, so why are we here again? It's an opportunity to learn, to network, to share knowledge, to take knowledge, to build those relationships that are going to allow you to be more effective, both in your business, but most importantly in our community as we're trying to address the affordable housing issues. All right, Polly, that was a lot. And now we're going to go to Director Donaldson, who you met earlier, and we're going to have a little coffee, water, and conversation with her and learn a little bit about her and her perspective on things. Let's give her a round of applause. Hi, Polly. Thank you for being here.
Good
Real
morning,
pleasure.
Brian.
Real
It's really
pleasure.
a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So let's start, and I assume most everyone, or a lot of people in the room, have either worked with you or certainly know what you do, but not everyone. So can you just give me a little bit of the high-level charge that you have as Director of the Department of Housing and Community Development?
Well, I am here because the vision of our Mayor, Muriel Bowser, in terms of the importance of affordable housing and having a housing agency that can execute that vision with a great staff team, many of whom are here, that I hope you will get a chance to meet, and to know that we are here to maximize the production and preservation of affordable housing and to revitalize neighborhoods and communities across the district. That commitment is shown in terms not just of words, but also resources. But it's also very much a personal commitment, and it is one that comes from my 31 years of living here in the district. I grew up in Baltimore, but moved here in the late 80s, and I will tell you that since the first day here, my commitment to this community, the broad community in the district, is what drives me. It's what gets me up every morning and wanting to focus on that mission here.
Well, that's really, really important, and I want to come back to what drives you, but let me go back to your tools and the resources. So how many folks are we talking about? What's the budget?
Sure.
Just big picture.
Our
again,
headquarters
for
is
context.
right across the street, actually. The Department of Housing and Community Development has a staff of 180. Our annual budget is in the $250 million range and includes one of the resources that I know many in this room advocated for, including me, before I took this position, for our Housing Production Trust Fund. That has been budgeted since 2015 at $100 million a year, so this is the 4th year in a row we've had that as a resource at that level baked into the budget as Mayor Bowser committed. But we also have distinct resources, both federal. We're the agency that implements our federal housing resources from HUD, as well as our other resources that we've created, avenues and mechanisms to help encourage additional private investment. So our public dollars invested in our preservation fund to preserve existing affordable housing is leveraged 3-to-1 by private investment. And that's really our job, and my job at the department, is to come up with ways that we can expand what we're doing to do more, because we know of the great need for affordable housing, for housing across the continuum, across income levels, across the district.
Well, thank you for your leadership in that area. Now I want to go back to that driving. So you haven't been in government your whole career. In fact, I know obviously prior you were running a nonprofit also focused on housing issues. But let's go further back. So what either in your upbringing or why housing, why this industry, what is it that concerns you or drives you to be involved in this particular space?
Sure. I grew up in Baltimore, in the northern part of the city. It was a city much like DC that has distinct neighborhoods, and it was something in terms of my growing up and my experiences. Knew that I was committed to not just urban, but also to creating a fair and equitable society and being part of that actively, proactively, not just sitting on the sidelines. I've had many different experiences in my life. I've lived overseas, and my first career here in the district was in international community development. I actually started way back as a teacher, a history teacher and social studies teacher, and lived in South America teaching at an American school way back. And I have to say, teaching middle school, for those of you who have experienced that or have a middle schooler, I can tell you it teaches you great discipline and also great creativity as you look to engage.
And patience.
And patience as well, yes, patience. I will say, though, that really, I loved the classroom, I loved teaching, did that for 5 years, but really wanted to be engaged and involved directly in community, and got involved in a political campaign for one of my great sheroes, Barbara Mikulski, native of Baltimore, and that's how I got to D.C. after her election in 1986 as a Democrat, one of the first Democratic women senators elected in her own right. And that was a significant campaign, and one that then did open doors here, and that's really, for me, I've had lots of more windows opening than doors, quite frankly, and taking those opportunities and saying that just because I haven't done something before doesn't mean I can't has really been an important driving force. But I will say, when I came here to the district, it was important, even though my work was in international development, I wanted to be engaged locally. And through my church, St. Margaret's Episcopal Church at DuPont Circle, I was able to engage almost immediately in really what was the greatest crisis in the late 80s, which was housing homeless families, particularly those who were victims of the crack epidemic and needing to, many who had recovered from their addiction, wanting to reunite with their families. And so I got involved with an organization that at that time was called Transitional Housing Corporation, now known as Housing Up. And but that was 30 years ago that I got involved.
No, I think that's important for people to have a perspective of the path and the different places in which you worked on housing issues. So I guess I shouldn't ask the Washington team or the Ravens, given that you are from Baltimore, but...
well, I'm actually a Colts fan, as they say.
Okay, there we go. We're going way back.
And I remember
now.
that dark night in March of 1993 when the moving van took my team away.
Yes, yes.
Some other city.
Well, going back to your nonprofit days, I wanted you to, just for the benefit of the audience and for me and all of us, there's a continuum around housing, all the way from emergency through transitional to home ownership. Can you just chat a little bit about that continuum? You know, lay the field for us so we have a sense of that.
Well, like many of you in this room, I ran a nonprofit organization, but my greatest learning really was through working in coalition with so many of you in this room, particularly under the leadership of Bob Pullman at the Coalition for Nonprofit Housing and Economic Development, where I learned so much and also rose to understand the importance of advocacy and how what that can do to build political will in a community across boundaries and borders and communities in that way. The continuum, which was really, and it's even more important today, we are facing an overall supply issue when it comes to housing, not just of affordable housing, but of housing in our region, in our city, in the district. That continuum goes from emergency housing and addressing homelessness for families and individual, to affordable housing and home ownership, as you said, across that spectrum, across income levels. But it's very important, I think, to understand that we really can't just focus on one segment of that continuum, but really must address all. And that there are many of you who address one area of that continuum in this room, but I will say that is all, I think, absolutely critical and important. With our homeless system, I think that there have been some absolutely great strides made in really doing a systemic change for how we are working to end homelessness, not just manage it or maintain it, but to end homelessness in our community.
And which of those buckets, if you will, along the continuum, as director, are you involved in? And more importantly, which is the most difficult to try and make great strides on?
Well, I think we're involved in many of the buckets. On homelessness, we are actively encouraging the creation of the permanent housing that homeless families and individuals can move to, particularly a form of homeless housing known as permanent supportive housing, which combines resources from multiple agencies and the private sector to create permanent wraparound services in a housing setting, creates the stability under which people can maintain their exit from homelessness and be able to be stably housed. But that's just one area. We also, with our support for and development finance, are funding housing, affordable housing for very low income, those who are from the making very little or next to nothing in terms of income, to up to $25,000 to $30,000 a year. So very low income, and knowing that that is the housing that needs to be most heavily subsidized. It's what government does. It's what the market isn't creating on its own, but will do in partnership with government with the subsidies, either an operating subsidy or the finance subsidy that we can do. But there's also a middle middle income levels of housing that we have to address. The working families, the working individuals who want to live here, want to raise their children, or who have been here for many generations and want to stay here in the district, so that we know that there has to be, again, intentional. And our Housing Trust Fund has very intentional allocations by income level of where the housing resources need to go. Why? Because that's where, again, government can and should be intentional. That's why we are able to invest our resources, leveraging private resources as well. But the intentionality, the policy setting comes from government, but obviously with a lot of community engagement and input.
And Polly, which of those challenges you most as director?
I think wanting to ensure that we are reaching our very most vulnerable and our lowest income, I think, is absolutely critical. I also know, though, that we want to see pathways to more affordability, pathways to the middle class. Home ownership becomes critical with that. I would say that becomes challenging in this economic environment as costs rise, as the cost of housing rise. Some of our increases in the home purchase assistance program, down payment assistance for first-time home buyers, has been specifically to address current market conditions, increasing the size of the down payment so that we can make it so first-time buyers can buy a house here in the district.
Unfortunately, we have a lot of participants alongside you from the private sector as well as nonprofits here in all of those efforts. Yes. Let me jump to opportunity zones. So the Treasury Secretary has suggested that OZ opportunity zones may unleash $100 billion in capital flowing into underserved communities as designated by the governors or the mayor of each state. And regulations were issued on Friday, as I mentioned, as we talked about earlier. I guess I have really two questions. What's exciting about OZ zones? What's scary about it as it applies to housing? And while you're at it, what are the tools that the public sector, other than designating the particular census tracts, what are the tools that you or this administration has to ensure that the public purpose is also being fulfilled?
Sure. Well, as many of you know, the regs were just issued on Friday, and I can tell you that there are elements that provide a few more answers, because there was a lot of unknown in terms of how exactly the program would be structured, if at all. I mean, quite frankly, it's created as a tax benefit, or and so as a way to alleviate. So it's really, that is the driving force. It's not being created as a housing program. However, it is from the analysis that folks in the development and the housing public policy areas have determined, there are going to be additional resources. How they get then matched with what, for example, local government, we have a very robust across the district affordable housing effort. developments that are either under construction or in pipeline right now, and projecting to do even more. The goal we've achieved 6,000 units. We have another 5,200 under construction. Mayor Bowser's made it clear to me and has said this publicly that another 10,000 units at a minimum must be part of our goal, our tangible goal that we are looking to reach, and to be able to do more leveraging private dollars. So how is that going to match up with where the fact is there's not a lot of control, if you will, over where those individual investments will be made with the opportunity zones. That said, it really then becomes incumbent on government, and our Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development, Brian Kenner, and his team are the principal drivers of helping to match up our designated opportunity zones with opportunities or with investors who want to come in. That, again, that said, it has to be intentional. And the outreach and the public, I won't say recruitment, but to really do the marketing of opportunities and where they are, and then to see how in this coming year that shakes out, how it really ends up being operational.
So that's one variable that may fuel land escalation in prices in housing. We have another that potentially the Amazon HQ2 that might also do the same thing. Do you have any thoughts about, are you gunning for that? Are you worried about that? And, how's that going to impact what we all are trying to do here? Well, should it happen?
Exactly. Well, I think our mayor said it best. Obviously, D.C. It's obviously D.C. And that is what we have put forth. What we think is a very strong proposal. We're in the currently still in the running, and will be our part of conversations. Again, our deputy mayor Brian Kenner is leading the effort with the mayor on that and all on the housing front related to that. And I would submit that regardless of whether HQ2 comes we're selected or not, both we need to increase our supply of housing for the jobs that are predicted in the future. I work with our local regional entities through our Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. I co-chair their housing advisory committee, and know that what we're doing here in the district really needs to be also reflected regionally, and that we really need a region effort that involves Maryland and Virginia, Annapolis and Richmond, as well as the district, to make this happen. So the overall supply needs to increase, and that also means the overall supply of affordable housing. But the two are very much related together. Obviously, we are an area that I can just tell you, I've come back from a meeting with the housing directors of the 9 highest cost cities in the country, and we just met in Chicago, and I will say that we are all, without exception, in cities where the populations are increasing, where the demand and costs for land and real estate are increasing, but at the same time where all of us are making aggressive efforts to address affordability, to address overall housing supply, and to be sure that we are actually not sharing our best practices, but really being innovative and creative in that way.
So, Polly, should we march down to Calorama and say, just pull the trigger, Jeff, or
I think the timing, my understanding is the timing's by the end of this year, and I think that there is, I think we're ready to be able to do more, yes, which is really what yes, the charge is to do, and that the being able to find and create the housing for the jobs that will be created.
Understood. And you notice I said Jeff, as if, we're hanging out every week. Back to the, you mentioned the high-cost cities housing forum, which I think is just really interesting. So these are commissioners or heads yes, of all of the, some of the most expensive cities, including Boston, San Francisco, LA, Chicago, et cetera, Denver as well. So when you all are together, as you were on Monday, what do you bring back? Like, are they doing something really cool that we need to think about in some of those other cities?
I would say, yes, there are some very interesting new ideas and creative ideas. I will be very clear. They are also looking to us in D.C. We are doing, in terms of investing resources, more per capita than any of those 8 other cities, and that is something that we are that it's very clear that our leadership and how we have put together the resources, the dedicated revenue stream for the Housing Production Trust Fund, the whole preservation strategy that Mayor Bowser asked me and my department to develop in conjunction with our stakeholders in the community who care deeply about preserving existing affordable housing, the mechanisms that we use, the fact is we have TOPA, we have the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, and no other jurisdiction has the ability to do preservation via a right to purchase that tenants have, that in conjunction that over the past 30 years has evolved with the development community into a really productive tool of preservation for preserving existing affordable housing in communities. That said, I know also that Boston has come up with some really creative ways of engaging the development community beyond just a fee-based. They are doing some incentives that would help make that happen. LA just passed an enormous bond to enable them to address their homeless issue, to create the permanent housing that is going to help address the issue that everyone in LA can see, the encampments on the streets and Skid Row and beyond, actually. There are real issues that we are all dealing with and having to be creative in addressing.
So a final question, just noting our time. So Polly, everyone's always trying to get to you, I assume, to talk to you about their project, what they're trying to push forward, and I assume you're anxious to hear them. Incidentally, she will be around all day, so hopefully I didn't just open you up to it. But everyone, feel free to chat with Polly throughout Director Donaldson throughout the day, and she can share more of her ideas. But here's the question: what's the one thing about your job that we could never, envision, or what's the one thing you'd like us to know about being director that's unique?
Well, first of all, I have a fantastic team. Well, DHCD staff, raise your hand, those who are here. They're terrific. And we have accomplished so much as an agency, and I thank you for that. That's a great ending question, because it really is a way to say this is an agency that has, over the past 4 years, really become, I think, incredibly high performing. We got more resources out the door this past year, $168 million of Housing Production Trust Fund out the door into projects. Those projects are going to be coming online over the next 2 years across the district, and being able to see that real effort and work in that way. But what I will say in terms of what the department does, we have to be out in the community, but we also have to work with everyone in here. I am fortunate. I get to now implement and use the resources that I advocated for as a member of the development community, the nonprofit development community. And I must say that is it is not only personally very rewarding, but it also is, I think, rewarding to remember that, advocacy with a purpose has impact, it has effect. We've been able to change how we do housing here in the district, and the government, as a partner with you, is very much in the role of being a proactive force to help really achieve the equitable development that the district needs and wants.
Well, Polly, thank you for this today. Thank you for your service. We really do appreciate it, and your passion around housing. And let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you.
As I transition, I noticed that Councilman White had come in. I wanted to thank you for being here. This is, I believe we're talking about issues that you and I have chatted about that are important to you. And again, thank you for being here. We're going to go, I mentioned my good friend and colleague, Ed Lazier, who is the executive director of the DC Fiscal Policy Institute. I think we may be getting his AV. Do we got it straight? Okay, good. Ed has actually been led the work of the DC Fiscal Policy Institute since its inception in 2001. In particular, what I believe he's going to be talking today about, and he may take some liberties to expand a little bit more, really is about the the approved 2019 budget of the city and the implications on housing from the city's budget. So let's welcome him, and thank you for being here, Ed, and you can take the stage.
Righty. Well, I'm just going to leave it like that. All right, well, good morning, everybody. Come on, good morning, everybody. Let's send some energy up here. So I'm really glad to be here today. I really appreciate City First sponsoring this forum on this incredibly important issue of affordable housing in the city, and I appreciate all of you being here. I'm really glad that I get to be a part. If you will indulge me, I would like to start with a personal story. So my wife and I were fortunate enough to buy a house in Brookland 26 years ago, and it's been our only home. And we raised 2 children in that house, 2 boys, and they are now grown up, 21 and 24, and have left the house. So while my wife and I are living this empty nest life and enjoying that tremendously, we're also thinking about downsizing because we have too much house and we have a big yard, and we don't need that. We want to pass that on to another family who needs it. And beyond thinking about where are we going to actually move that we can afford, even with our very solid incomes, my sons have already started talking to us about how important their home was to them growing up, the nostalgia that they're going to have, how they don't want us to move. Even the clubhouse that I built in the backyard that they never used because they thought it was filled with hornets. It's not. Other kids have enjoyed it tremendously. But it's just a really important reminder of how important our homes are for our psychic well-being, for our physical well-being, how important our neighborhoods are. And of course, that's not just me, it's not just you, it's everybody. So the issue of affordable housing is just so critical to family and community stability and to the future of the District of Columbia. That's why today's topic is so important, and why what you all are doing to make sure that we're investing adequately in affordable housing is important as well. So what I'm going to talk about very briefly is just sort of where are we with regards to affordable housing in the district, and a little bit about the challenges we face, but also about the role of the city, because that is a lot of what I work on, is what's the city's role, what's their partnership, and what do we need from the city to make sure that you all have the resources to create affordable housing here in the district. So for those who don't know me or the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, our mission is to address the city's really large and growing economic and racial inequities, to try to increase economic opportunity for DC residents. And we do that through conducting research on the challenges that low-income families face, like the loss of affordable housing, and then working with allies and advocating with the mayor and people like Polly Donaldson and the council to put more money in the budget for things that are important, and to change policy and legislation to shape the things that we need. And the short answer to this question of where do we stand is that, as you heard from Polly Donaldson, the district is doing a lot, and Mayor Bowser deserves a tremendous amount of credit for really ramping up the city's support and investment in affordable housing. But it's also the case, as we all know, that the needs are so enormous that we just need to do a lot more, that we're not doing enough. I'm going to walk you through a few slides just very briefly to sort of lay out in my big overview of sort of the conditions, the issues, and then I'm also, if it all works at the end, we're going to pull up an interactive map that the DC Fiscal Policy Institute released just last month. So, at its most basic, we all know that the city has enormous affordable housing challenges, that there are more and more families who are being squeezed by high housing costs, creating instability when we need more stability, and making it so much harder for many families to continue to afford to live in the city. Most of those families who are facing those stresses, of course, are families of color, and it's really important that we address those needs. One way that we look at that at the DC Fiscal Policy Institute is the extent to which families are paying more than half their income on housing, because clearly that is an unsustainable and stressful burden. And the chart that we're going to pull up in a minute shows that, not surprisingly, the share of families at all income levels who are spending more than half their income on housing in DC is grown, but it's particularly significant for our lowest income families, with incomes below 30% of area median income. So we can cue the first one. Sorry if that's a little too small and hard to read, and I'll just take a quick peek at it while you also stare at it. So if you can't read it, what this shows are the blue bars are the share of households in 2002 who spent more than 50% of their income on housing, and the red is the same number for 2015, and we look at different income levels. And as you see, the bars have grown. The red bars are higher than the blue bars at all income levels, but I think what's most significant is that the majority, over 60% of families with incomes below 30% of area median income are now spending more than half their income on housing, and in many cases, it's 80% or more of their income. And in some ways, that's sort of shocking, but when you just sit back and think about it, it's also not so shocking. You know, the average Social Security benefit in the district is about $1,400 a month. You can imagine that easily as someone living on that, paying more than half their income on housing. Minimum wage job, even with DC's really high minimum wage, is about $2,000 a month pre-tax. Again, if that's your sole source of income, it's not hard to imagine with the city's incredibly rising housing costs that those families are being stressed and unable to pay their rent. And these numbers aren't just a matter of, oh, you know, families are at risk of perhaps not being able to pay their rent. The lack of affordable housing and the stresses and instability that it causes have dramatic impacts in all sorts of ways. Just as I talked about my family and how important our home has been, if you don't have that stable, affordable housing, the impacts can be dramatically negative. So, for example, research confirms, and it's really not a shock, that if you're spending most of your income on housing every month, your refrigerator is likely to not be full. And if you have subsidized housing, you're much more likely to have food in your refrigerator. So the lack of affordable housing not only creates stresses specifically on housing, but also on the basics of health and nutrition. We know that when parents are worried month in and month out about how are they going to pay their rent and their other bills and keep their home and protect their children, those stresses lead to high rates of depression and other mental health problems. And yet, when you have those problems and you don't have any money in your pocket, you also may not be getting to see a medical professional, even if you have health care coverage, because you may not have bus fare or because you're spending all of your time just figuring out how you're going to get your rent money that month. And we know that those stresses of and instability from the lack of affordable housing has dramatic impacts on children as well. That when you're in unaffordable housing and you're not sure where you're going to live month to month, when you're moving frequently, when you become homeless, when you might be living in overcrowded or physically unsafe housing, living with people that your parents choose to live with or live with not out of choice, but because they have to save rent, that creates tremendous stresses on children. And they carry that with them when they leave the home, when they go to schools. So we know that when children are in families spending most of their income on housing, that those children have behavioral and cognitive challenges in school and are less likely to graduate from high school and go on to work as adults. And you know, the good news is that the reverse is also true, that when families have affordable housing, whether it's naturally affordable or subsidized, that all of those things get better. Children do better, parents do better, they're more likely to stay in jobs, families are more stable and healthy. And that's, again, why it's so important that we figure out what we can do to create more affordable housing. So the next slide I'm going to show you just talks about sort of where we've been in the last 4 years in developing affordable housing. As Secretary Donaldson said, we've done a lot, and I believe Mayor Bowser deserves an amazing amount of credit for campaigning 4 years ago in her first run on affordable housing as a major part of her platform, committing to put $100 million in the Housing Production Trust Fund and then doing that every single year, as well as putting money into other housing programs like the Preservation Fund that Polly Donaldson talked about. And that's terrific. But the challenges are so enormous that we're not making the dent that we want. So the next chart you're going to see in just a minute looks at the number of units that are in the pipeline or that have been developed in the last 4 years compared to the need. And you can go ahead and cue that one up. So again, this is also at income level, broken out by income level. So just to let you stare at it for a second. So you see that for families with incomes below 30% of area median income, there are 26,000 roughly who are spending more than half of their income on housing, severely rent burdened every month. And in the last 4 years, we've developed about 3,000 units to help them. We've also not quite met the need for families with incomes between 30 and 50% of area median income. for those between 50 and 80%, the development of new housing in the last 4 years is actually roughly close to the number who face affordable housing challenges at a severe level, not meaning that, of course, it's fully meeting the need. And I say this as a reminder, and you all know that financing housing that meets our lowest income families, that minimum wage worker, that parent on that elderly person living on Social Security, someone with income at $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, making housing affordable for them just through your finance is, if not impossible, nearly impossible, right? And that's why we really need government support, government involvement to make a difference. So I put these numbers up not to criticize the Bowser administration. As I said, they're doing tremendous things, but just a reminder of how enormous the challenges are, how much farther we have to go, and the importance of making sure that we are using government finance to reach our lowest income families, as Polly Donaldson also talked about. So, the last thing I want to talk about is sort of where we are budget-wise, as Brian talked about, so I will get to what you actually said. So the 2019 budget that was adopted just this past June maintains the $100 million for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. It includes $10 million for preservation of affordable housing, new funding for local rent supplement, our rent subsidy program. And I should say, before we go to the next slide, really the key to making this chart look different is, of course, building more, but it is rental assistance, right? As you know, financing just through finance, even with government support, housing that reaches the lowest income families is really, really hard to do. And so often, to really reach those very low income families, we need construction subsidies, but also ongoing rental assistance. We're fortunate in DC that we have our local rent supplement program to do that. And then the question is, really, are we doing enough? And that sort of brings us to the next slide, which we'll do in just a minute. Oh, that's fine. There it is. Ta-da. The district is in the 2019 budget. Our housing budget is a roughly $300 million. That is a big number, and it's probably a record level, the highest we've ever spent in the city. And yet, when you compare it to the other major elements of the city's budget, like schools, like public safety, even what we spend on debt for capital projects, it's nowhere near that number. So I really think, and this, my budget hat here at the DC Fiscal Policy Institute is we need a paradigm shift in how we think about affordable housing in the city, not as something that is a supplement as to our budget, but as important as what we invest in schools, as important as what we invest in public safety. If we really understand that family stability is tied to housing stability, and we know that we are desperately in need of affordable housing, that has to be a goal. So I would love to see over the next 10 years that little light blue bar become much closer to what we spend on housing, or what we spend on schools, and what we spend on public safety. The DC Fiscal Policy Institute actually tried to figure out how much this would cost in a report that we did this spring. And of course the number is big, but it's actually not bigger than the bars here. So over the next 10 years, if we really want to address the affordable housing needs of our very lowest income families, those with incomes below 30% of area median income, we will need to spend $1 billion, ultimately spend $1 billion. That's a combination of things like the Housing Production Trust Fund and local rent supplement, putting them together to reach those families. It's a huge number, but I also think that as a prosperous city and a caring city, that over the next 10 years, if we put our mind to it, that we can accomplish that, and I hope that we can. So the last thing that I want to pull up, and make sure that I'm doing fine on time, I think I will wrap up in just a minute, is in September, the DC Fiscal Policy Institute put out an interactive map, which you can go ahead and pull up now. I think if you click on, there's a link to it in the first paragraph. See right? Yeah. Are you able to click on that? Oh. Let's see if we have. Oh, look. That is really zoomed out. Yeah, I'll just describe it. So, so we pulled together for the, I think, first time a unique data set that maps every affordable housing project that has either been constructed or under construction in the pipeline over the last 4 years. And the interactive tool allows you to break it out by ownership versus rental, by income level, whether it's new construction or preservation, and for each option to let you focus just on one issue or all of them together. And so our website is dcfpi.org. I hope you will check this interactive tool out. The things that we drew away from it, the most important things, is that when you look at the map, there has been almost no affordable housing been built in or financed in Ward 3. Less than 1% of the 10,000 units that have been financed are in Ward 3. Of course, it's really expensive to build there, but it's also places where families might have more stable neighborhoods and access to schools that they might want. So even if it costs more money, it seems like it's really important that we use our resources to finance housing throughout the city, including in Ward 3. And the second key finding is the one that we've already talked about. I've already talked about that. Our housing programs are not reaching our lowest income families at the level we want. When you look at the full map for all income levels, and then you zoom in just to look at the housing for folks with incomes below 30% of area median income, it shrinks dramatically. So I think I'm going to wrap it up there. The good news is that we have all of you here as talented professionals. We have a caring government. We have citizens who care about these issues. We have the tools. We have a housing production trust fund. We have local rent supplement. We have a law that says public land, when it is disposed of by the city for housing, has to include a substantial amount of affordable housing. We have the land trust, the Douglas Land Trust, that many of you are involved in supporting, and we just need to do more of that with the goal of creating housing that's affordable to our lowest income families and as permanently as affordable as possible. And I know that together, working together, we can tackle this enormous challenge. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Wonderful job, both explaining how, as I said earlier, how foundational housing is, but also outlining the scale of the issue that we're all working on. So thank you, Ed. Fantastic presentation. Let's go ahead and get our panel assembled toward the stage in this order. Chris Miller, Tyrone Garrett, Art Fleming, Brian Athey, and Jim Knight. And then our moderator and my colleague, Carl Hairston, is coming down. As they assemble on the stage, I'll give you a little bit of background. First of all, this is an expert panel that will discuss some of the things they're both doing and some of the lessons they've learned along the way. As they are seated, let me tell you a little bit about our moderator. As I mentioned, all the bios of the speakers are in your program, but a couple of our moderators are not, but they are on cityfirstfoundation.org. So let me tell you a little bit about Carl. He's our Executive Vice President and our Chief Lending Officer at City First Bank. We got a lot of activity here. That's good. And he's really charged with both the strategic direction of our lending and business development efforts, as well as execution. Carl is a seasoned finance professional. I wasn't going to say the number here, but over 26 years, which means you're getting old, buddy, of financial experience. We grabbed him from M&T Bank back in 2006, where he was a regional vice president leading their business and professional services group. So Carl and your panel, thank you first for assembling, and I'll give you the stage.
So good morning, everybody. Glad to have you all here. We're gonna jump right in. I think as Brian alluded to earlier, in your program booklet you have all of the bios, so we're not going to use up any of that time giving introductions of the folks who are on the panel. But the only thing I'm going to do, just to make sure everybody knows who's on the panel, starting to my immediate left, we have Tyrone Garrett from the DC Housing Authority. We have Art Fleming, who's responsible for Community Investment Services. He directs all of that activity for the Federal Home Loan Bank of Atlanta, of which we're a part of, and a member organization of the Federal Home Loan Bank. We have Chris Miller, who is with the DC Housing Finance Agency, and he's going to talk a little bit about the Housing Investment Platform, the HIP program. We have Brian Athey. Brian is an attorney, And Brian is really on the panel because he's going to talk about, sort of financing and how do you put these transactions together. And then Jim Knight is the executive director of Jubilee Housing here in Washington, and they're doing some amazing things over at that organization, which we're going to have an opportunity to hear from everybody on the panel, and then we will open it up for Q&A thereafter. Okay? All right, so we're good to go. So I'm going to start off with the question that I want to ask each of the panelists to answer, and that is, not everybody defines affordable housing the same way. So I think it's going to be important to really get this started off to understand how does each of these folks on the panel look at affordable housing? How do they define affordable housing? And then that's going to then take us into a discussion regarding affordable housing versus workforce housing. And is workforce housing affordable housing? And should they be conflated? Should they be commingled or not? So why don't we start off with you, Tyrone? How does the DC Housing Finance or DC Housing Authority define affordable housing?
I think for most people, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. I think for the DC Housing Authority, what we believe is that we're serving the lowest income residents across the board within the district. What I also believe that we have other residents in our portfolio that have incomes that range up to anywhere to $40,000 on an annual basis. So I think we are asked to do a lot for many people across the district. In reality, I don't think everyone necessarily always recognizes that, because when you say public housing, you're always thinking 30% and below. When in actuality, I think we have a myriad of a lot of residents that have a larger range in terms of their incomes.
Gotcha. Art?
So, Carl, I think the question is really more of a programmatic question and a branding and NIMBY and advocacy question, right? So from a programmatic standpoint, look, we look at 80% and below as a basic eligibility for the funding from the Federal Home Loan Bank, and I know I'll have a chance later to talk about the Federal Home Loan Bank and the equity that we put out into the marketplace. But I've had some discussions recently, particularly in a community down in South Carolina, Bluffton, South Carolina, and they posed this very same question about whether or not they should brand themselves as advocates of workforce housing or as advocates of affordable housing, and why was the question even raised. And it had a lot to do with convincing those that were on the fringes of the discussion that they should join the fray, right? That they should join in and sort of push this issue as one of community concern, as opposed to one to be, as opposed to an issue to be opposed by a segment of the population. So I don't know if this community has had that sort of discussion about how it intends to brand, this whole effort of providing housing for our service sector employees and for those that are not at the income level that the market right now is satisfying. But it's an important discussion to have.
Awesome. So that sets it up right up for you, Chris. Yeah. And I know with the DC Housing Finance Agency, you guys play a significant role on the low-income housing tax credit side, as well as now on this workforce housing piece. So give us DCHFA's perspective.
So DCHFA, we exist to facilitate affordability of housing in the city. We have traditionally defined that as 60% of AMI and below, particularly because that lines up with the low-income housing tax credit. And our primary business line is allocating the 4% credits and the mortgage revenue bonds. But in addition to that, we're starting to look at affordability outside of that bucket. In the 60 to 120% AMI range, and a lot of the people in that range are, city government employees, your fire and EMS, teachers that are, make a little bit too much money to live in a low-income housing tax credit property, but the average house in the city, single-family dwelling, sells for about $825,000, they don't make enough money to go out and purchase one of those. And so there's this gap in between where the market is transacting at, creeping up towards $1 million, and you have people that make too much money to live in your traditional low-income housing tax credit property.
Great, thank you. Brian?
First of all, I want to thank City First Bank for having us today. This is a great event. I'm honored to be here talking with all these experts on affordable housing. For me, it's educational. I think for all of us, it is. I come at this from a little bit of a different angle. I own a real estate lending company, and I loan money to people that buy and flip houses and do 2 to 20 unit apartment and condominium projects, both west of the river and east of the river. And when I look at it, what I look at in terms of affordability is my borrowers go to where they see need and where they see opportunity. And so what's happened over the past few years is there's been a real affordability crisis, obviously. And so west of the river, they've seen that prices have risen dramatically. And they've seen many of my borrowers have started doing small apartment projects east of the river in an attempt to provide affordable housing. I think have done a nice job. And sort of my message today overall will really be that the simpler government can make the provision of affordable housing, the more money that will flow into it. I mean, I personally, I'm a lawyer by background, a classically educated person, and I find the tax credit program very complicated. I think simplicity, in governmental programs will bring money into the system. The easier you make it, the better in terms of providing affordable housing.
We're going to have plenty of dialogue about that. So, Jim?
See if I got that right. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be on this panel and to have the opportunity to think with you about these important questions. I would just point out first, as a developer of affordable housing, we sort of end up having to target the income levels that others have deemed important programmatically. So I would point to HUD's definitions of 80% AMI as the upper limit for low-income households, the 50% AMI bucket as the target for very low-income households, and then the 30% as extremely low income. And so we're sort of referenced those points, and a lot of our city resources, including the Housing Production Trust Fund, mirror those limits. So we sort of look there. I would point out our work at Jubilee tends to focus on those most at the 30 and below level. 2/3 of our apartment homes are priced in that area, and another third in between 30% AMI and 60% AMI. And I think this workforce question that you're pushing us to address is an important one. I think most of the time that I hear that phrase, it is thinking about that 80% and above sort of AMI band, the classic employment options that we're thinking over teachers and first responders. And obviously those are critical roles in a community. I would make the point, though, that most people in housing are working. Most people in our apartment communities are working, upwards of 3/4, even those who are at 30% AMI and below. An important marker for sort of our metro area, the 30% AMI band moves a little each year based on median income, and minimum wage moves a little bit too, but roughly speaking, a single 40-hour-a-week minimum wage earner is right at 30% AMI. It's a point higher one year and a point lower another year. But that's a working person, working as hard as any of the rest of us, needing affordable rents to them as well.
So let me just stay with that, Jim, and we can work our way around. I mean, should we be conflating the two? I mean, should we, in the same sentence, be talking about affordable housing and workforce housing at the same time? And then how do you manage that from a policy standpoint?
Yeah, Carl, I think this is a good one for all of us to be thinking about. I think from a branding perspective, Art, you mentioned earlier, we need to think about a message that is going to be well received by our citizenship so that we can generate will to support everyone. I would say that everyone needs support. There ought to be housing across all of the income spectrum, no matter what the job title is. They're all important. So is conflating dangerous or beneficial? I would say one way that it can be dangerous is that if a set of employment options end up being valued more than others, and we think of people at the 80% AMI and higher bands at doing the more important work, and people lower than that less important work, that's very dangerous. And so I would say that's a big caution. Just to point out a few just critical employment positions in our community and in our economy that are at the lower end. Child care workers tend to be in the low $30,000 range. That's a fraction above 30% AMI. Any less important than any other employment option? So
More, some would argue.
raising our kids, right? So that I think is important. Programmatically, I think a jurisdiction has to get its arms around how many units we need at each income level. And if calling them one thing helps create the will to produce it, then that may well be important.
Perfect. Let me ask Chris, what about you?
I agree with everything he just said. I would say that a lot of times people at the lower income band are working actually harder than us in 80, 120, and above that. So from that perspective, I think you're right. But you have to call it something. You have to brand it and market it because if you go in front of people and start talking about AMIs, a lot of times you lose them. And so you kind of have to give them examples of, what kind of jobs fit into this range in order for them to conceptually understand what you're doing.
One thing I want to point out to everyone and for us to remember is that with public housing, conventional public housing, there is no AMI that we're setting forth to allow residents to live with us. They can have 30% or below in terms of their income, but they're only going to be paying 30% of their actual income each year. So if we have a resident that increases their earnings over time, we're not asking them to move. They're still paying 30% until they reach that particular threshold. That's when we come into the problem. Is there another program that's out there that's available for them to be able to move on to, such as a home ownership program or something that's somewhat different? And that's where we come into the workforce housing and that particular issue, because we have some residents who have increased their income over time. Their threshold right now would be a lease amount that probably in certain markets would be feasible for them to live outside of public housing, but here in the district it would be very difficult.
So let me stay with you, Tyrone. I mean, is public housing, we're all familiar with it. Different people look at it different ways. But is it something of the past? I mean, is public housing still relevant?
Yes, definitely. It is definitely a relevant start for a family's future. It gets them moving and gets them motivated to move on to other things. It's, again, 30% of their income, that's what they're going to be paying. Where we come in and have a problem as a housing authority from a problem is we're trying to do two things. We're trying to stabilize current housing stock and then work with our other partners, the district and other housing providers throughout the area to build more units of housing. So we're asked to do all these things at the same time. Preserve what we have for earners who are below the current AMI standard of 80%, and then create housing for those same individuals that are on our waiting list. And that becomes and proves to be very difficult at times.
And then with public housing, talk about, and I know from talking with you, you are extremely passionate about this, but what are some of the misconceptions or perceptions around public housing and the people who live in public housing? Are they employed? Are they unemployed?
That was, I did bring a slide. I don't know if we have it and can throw it up real quick, but there was a slide that I brought with me which actually identified who our residents are. Do they work on a daily basis and what their actual earnings are? Are they college educated? And I can tell you, yes, they are. Many of our residents do have a college education. Many of them work in the service field within the district. Many of them have children that they're actually providing for. So the myths and stigmas that are normally set out there for residents who are living in public housing are misnomers. And now that's why I say they fall into this other category of that workforce housing. Is that something that we need to start creating? I don't think public housing is lost. But I do think we need to recreate some other programs that will be beneficial to the community.
Gotcha. Anybody else want to comment on that? All right. So Art, you bring.
A little slow here, Carl. Sorry. This brain's
no worries.
Behind a little bit this morning. I just would make one comment. This is not an area of personal expertise, but I think the question of private and public ownership of public housing continues to be crucial, and I think we have to be careful about over-privatization and the risk that the stewardship responsibility for families can be lost. And so I think, in my view, public housing needs to be around to ensure those who have no other housing options that there will be some.
Good feedback. Thank you. Art, you bring a broad perspective in your capacity with the Federal Home Loan Bank, and you get to see how other jurisdictions are approaching affordable housing. And you get to see, best practices and not so best practices. But what feedback would you share for those in this audience who are very interested in this topic?
Well, thank you, Carl. And also thank you, I didn't say it earlier, City First, for exhibiting the leadership in this community to convene this sort of gathering. I can tell you that not every city has a City First, right? Where you have not only, the capital that you provide from a transactional standpoint, but you have the power to convene and you have intellectual capital. And Brian Argrett is a member of the board of directors of the Federal Home Loan Bank, so he's my boss. And so I'll make sure I say really great things about City First Bank. Can I just take 30 seconds to sort of describe who and what we are? Because my guess is that the name itself is so misleading. The Federal Home Loan Bank, we're not a federal agency, so we're not a government agency, and we don't provide home loans, right? So we were talking about branding and marketing earlier.
Truly a misnomer.
Right? We were talking about branding and marketing earlier, and so we are perhaps the worst when it comes to branding and marketing. But we've been around since '32, and our job is to provide liquidity to financial institutions so that then they can turn around and extend capital to their customers, general balance sheet liquidity. And we're in that realm of Fannie and Freddie, but we're different in a lot of different ways. We're regionalized, and Federal Home Loan Bank of Atlanta district extends from Maryland, D.C., down to Florida, across to Alabama. We're about a $156 billion institution, but only 300 employees. And our job is to provide this equity. Now, for the last 30 years, we've been delivering equity to the affordable housing market through what we call the shared prosperity model. 10% of our net earnings go into this affordable housing pool. So if we do well and we pay a dividend to our shareholders, and Brian is a shareholder, our member institutions purchase stock, then we also pay a community dividend, right? We love this shared prosperity concept. If we do well, everybody does well. So let's think about a shared prosperity sort of model for other sort of quasi-governmental institutions, other GSEs, for example. The other thing, it's all about equity, right? It's the search for equity. As developers, every day your job is to look for equity, right? It's all about equity. So the question is, where are these, where's the equity coming from? And, the first step is always government. I've heard that mentioned. It's always government. But there's finite resources there. Unless, of course, and this is getting to the heart of your question, Carl, unless, of course, you go beyond legislative appropriation. If it's just legislative appropriation annually, you're going to be constrained by the legislative and political process. If there is a continuous revolving source of revenue that's outside of the political process, then there's a different sort of opportunity there. So the first thing I would suggest is that you look for opportunities for a continuous revolving source of revenue that has nothing to do with the annual legislative process. You guys know what's going on in Florida. They have a dock stamp sort of process, and the revenues from the dock stamp funds an affordable housing trust fund. But there are other opportunities as well. For example, public housing and some of the tax credit deals that exist here. Every single one of those tenants, more than likely they have a security deposit somewhere. More than likely it's in a non-interest bearing account. What about making a requirement that each of those security deposits be placed in an interest-bearing account, and the interest that's generated helps capitalize some sort of housing trust fund? In other words, let's just try to be creative in the ways in which we generate additional equity. The second, and I'll release the mic after this, the second sort of innovation that I've seen out there, Carl, has to do with a proactive engagement with foundations. small, medium, and large foundations. And the foundations are willing and able and have the interest to participate. They just lack the capacity to underwrite and to maintain an asset management sort of platform that they think is important to ensure that their funds are being used appropriately. So maybe, you know, maybe the local governments around could create some sort of platform in which they can make life a little easier for foundations to be involved with affordable housing.
That's great. So we're going to stay with the equity piece, because as a lender, we love equity. We love lots of it. So Brian, why don't we, because it's a perfect segue to tee that up right for you to talk about, you know, how do you approach some of these projects? Or when it comes to that equity piece and identifying, you know, the equity needed to pull these projects off. I mean, what's your approach? What do you want to share with the audience? I mean, what's challenging? Are there new ways we should be looking at this?
Yeah, well, you know, in terms of the equity, you know, I look at it, it's all about people, right? So, you know, with Harvey Yancey, who's in the audience, who won an award earlier this morning, you know, it's all, you form relationships with people, right? And then in terms of being a lender, you know, it's easy to put equity into deals with people that you have established relationships with. So, you know, for those who are trying to do deals, you know, that need equity, it's about building a relationship with a City First Bank, with a company like mine that will put money behind you. You know, as I said, I finance numerous buildings and.
That's Brian at Congressional Capital.
Yeah, that's right. And I'll pass out business cards
Congressional
later.
Capital.
But you know, that's really what it's about. You know, track records. But you know, companies like mine really are for folks in the beginning. You know, I mean, I start people out doing their first deal, their second deal, their third deal before many banks will talk to them, frankly. Mm-hmm. And then over time, you build deep relationships with them, and they'll borrow money from a City First Bank or from an Eagle Bank or somewhere else, and come back to me when they need me. And then, you know, as time goes on, you do more creative structures where you partner on deals and otherwise.
So that's also great, and thank you for mentioning Harvey, which we're all familiar with. You know, that really opens it up to really talk about the housing investment platform and the approach there, and how it's not only addressing affordable housing, but also helping with the whole equity piece. So Chris, why don't you talk about the HIP program?
So to an earlier point, out of the HIP platform, and I'll get into what we're doing with HIP, we originally approached this trying to make it look like what you would see similar if you were doing a private capital deal, to try to make it as simple and as easy to understand, and also as a training tool for an emerging developer to kind of understand how to transact in the real estate market. With HIP, what we're doing is we've created a fund initially with some of the agency's resources to co-invest with young emerging developers in the production of for-sale workforce housing. We're calling it workforce because we had to brand it. And that's targeted between 60 and 120% AMI. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're only limited to those particular buckets. We've seen projects that are looking at projects that have 50% AMI units. I've seen some stuff with market that I was a little scared of, market rate condos. But what we're trying to do is partner with emerging developers where we put up the majority of the capital, so we bring down the actual amount of capital that the developer has to bring to the table as far as equity capital in order to get a project built. We form a joint venture. We call you, Carl, at City First for a construction loan, and then we go off and we build what has been predominantly townhomes, but like I said earlier, we've also looked at some condos and also some non-traditional housing structures as well.
Can I jump in here? Yeah, I want to give City First and DCHFA credit for partnering with Harvey on the Elvins Road project. You know, I think he did 5 or 6 townhouse projects. That's how I learned first about this program. I think it's a great program. You know, it simplifies, which is what I talked about earlier, the capital structure, which is really important and encourages smaller developers to really be active in developing projects. Because one of the real barriers to entry in terms of developing affordable housing, in Ward 7s and 8, frankly, are the economics. So if you're a small developer and you want to buy a piece of real estate, you look at the land price and it looks okay, and then you look at what you build, your cost to build, and it's the same cost to build here as it is in DuPont Circle, right? But then what the voucher rents are on the back end don't allow you to do the deal, even though you want to do it. I mean, you want to provide affordable housing, you want to be a part of it. And that's a real barrier to entry, right? So programs like this really reduce those kind of barriers and will, in the end, incent more people to do more small projects and deliver better housing. So it's a great program.
Absolutely. Jim, I want to come back to you because I know Jubilee has done some amazing things in developing affordable housing. And as a nonprofit developer, I mean, what is your perspective and your approach on developing it? And what are some of your challenges as a nonprofit developer versus a for-profit developer?
Yeah, important questions. Several I could name easily, but I'll try to focus on a couple. So we operate in Adams Morgan, Columbia Heights, Mount Pleasant, high-cost neighborhoods where costs are going higher. So our biggest challenge these days are acquisition costs, and I'll say something about how we're dealing with that. It goes back to Art's comment about equity. We can generally find first position mortgage products, oftentimes even second position mortgages from a City First or a CDFI, but there's still an equity gap in the end that Jubilee needs to have. And one of our principal disadvantages as compared to larger market rate players is we have thinner balance sheets. We're deploying all of our resources into the product and into the services. A year or two ago, we started realizing that we were not able to compete for acquisitions in our footprint. We were losing in bids to market rate developers who were able to come up with all cash offers with no contingencies and short closing horizons, and so our traditional sources just couldn't move fast enough. So our board really rolled up its sleeves and decided that we needed to create our own acquisition fund. So we have done that. We've created a $5 million pool of resources that enable individuals, foundations, some banks to invest socially minded capital with us. Let us hold it for 3-4 years, and we'll give it back to you with 2% return when we're able to bring in the tax credits and the trust fund dollars and the AHP grants and the other things that make the permanent stack work. So we launched that earlier this spring and have had great success so far. We're quite heartened by the number of people in our community who care about this product and have raised a little over $3.5 million towards that 5, have closed on one purchase in August and closed on another one next week. So that is an approach that we sort of came to out of desperation, and I think in some ways are modeling what a private developer might do to source their own equity. I sometimes wish it wasn't necessary, but at the same time it is working.
So you all have been successful in developing affordable housing in mixed income neighborhoods. What's worked well, and how have you guys overcome some of the challenges in developing in mixed income neighborhoods, which you guys have been extremely successful at?
Yeah, and it is not easy work, and it takes a lot of partners. The list of sources in a Jubilee project is a mile deep, and it starts with as much first mortgage as we can support, and then it follows up with gap funding from the city, usually the trust fund, often federal home funds as we're a CHODO. Tax credits are integral, tax exempt bond financing is integral, but layering those pieces, there's inevitably still a gap. And we tend to go see Art's team most years and hope we can qualify for a grant there. And after that, we're usually still passing the hat in the community with our partners, foundation partners, individual donors, almost always bringing in $1 million+ of donated money to get the deal to work in the end.
So qualifying for a grant from Art's team. Art has grant money.
So is that my cue? Yeah, so as I said before, if we do well, then the community does well through our community dividends. So we deliver for it. Can I also offer one other, because you asked a question earlier about what are we seeing in other communities. And some of it has to do with, I think, what I've heard on the panel this morning about streamlining you know, the
big P, because housing authorities don't necessarily have the capacity. Now, DCHA is a different entity compared to some organizations across the country because of its size. We can do some projects on our own, and then other projects we would need partners to work on. An example would be, I just want to give one example, would be Parkway Overlook. That was a self-development deal that we worked on. That cost is in tune of $82 million, where we had to use several sources such as the tax credits and solar tax credits, along with a first mortgage actually that we had to throw on there.
And it's up on the screen.
Right, okay, so thank you. So that's a project that we self-developed.
Not that you can see it, but it's up there.
So that's one project that we did do on our own. But then when you move to other things like our traditional Hope 6 that we have at Arthur Caper, that was a product of a partnership. And we tried our best to work with those individuals. What happens though, and I have to tell you, to preserve that public housing aspect of it, you have to have more subsidy. You just have to have more subsidy put in, not only to construct the property, but also to actually operate it on a daily basis. And that's what we see as our biggest hurdle, and why sometimes we end up moving away from public housing in its traditional sense to try to recreate and create new opportunities for residents.
So that takes us to what everybody is talking about. I think Brian made reference to it, opportunity zones. And I think we're all starting to learn enough just to be dangerous. We know that. I think it was Friday afternoon, the first version of the regulations came out, and we know it's going to be multiple versions of it. But who wants to take it? How should you approach opportunity zones relative to affordable housing? Is there an opportunity? Can you make them work with affordable housing?
I'll take it. I'll go first. I look at it as an opportunity and a threat. On the opportunity side, and before I get into that, I like to think about like what the market structure is going to look like for this program once it gets off the ground. And I think Director Donaldson said earlier, it's a tax program first, and then a tool second for development second. And so because of that, I think that the market for this might look a little bit different than what we're traditionally used to in the affordable space. It might look more similar to something like EB5, which is another program that has an incentive that is being used for development. On the opportunity side, I think that it'll be helpful, or it could be helpful on projects that are mixed use or mixed income and have a affordable component to them. I don't necessarily, as from my read of some of the overviews of the regulations, I haven't made it through all 70 pages of it yet. There doesn't seem to be a lot directly that corresponds with affordable. And so that is also a threat, is that the rules and the guidance on this are wide open. So you can pretty much use this to do anything, and it doesn't necessarily have to be housing. You can build a hotel, you can build an office park if it's in an opportunity zone. And so the threat of this could be that it could incentivize a lot of land speculation that drives up the cost of land in areas that you would traditionally look to do a housing project.
Thank you.
I actually view it as a tremendous positive, because I think it's going to bring an influx of capital and reinvestment into areas that have been neglected. You know, I think that one of the things that it will do, to bring up my prior example of the deal that I actually looked at, that I tried to make work economically that didn't work, that close call deal, which was going to be a housing deal, which would have been a voucher deal, you know, it works in an opportunity zone, and here's why. You know, you can take your gain from another project, roll it in, and then deploy it and defer your, or actually, you know, essentially defer your tax consequences down the line, and do a deal that's a close call. So that it ends up causing a deal like that to be delivered instead of not delivered. You know, I mean, I think in the beginning it was like all things Trump. It was vague and broad, and nobody knew what was going on. And now, as you get more detail and you see that hey, you know, this actually has teeth to it. What it's caused people to do, you know, I have a development company too, and what it's caused us to do on that side of the house is focus in on, you know, where the opportunities are and put our attention into those areas and try to come up with creative ways to make projects work, but that have a long-term vision, because it really incents you to hold the real estate for a long time, which, you know, is good because it keeps people having a footprint into those communities and helps turn over assets that need to be turned over. So I think it's a real positive.
Art, thank you.
Yeah, so beyond the establishment of the zones, let's think through other roles for local sort of intermediary, some sort of syndicator, some sort of agent in place to find opportunities, to underwrite those opportunities, and then also issue reports that will be needed in order to obviously realize the tax benefit, right? So you know that. So why not proactively have local governments create their own pools, right? Their own opportunity zone pools. Proactively have local governments act as the agent, similar to what you have in the tax credit syndication world. Why not? Nothing stops a local government from creating a pool just for its own designated districts, right, for taxpayers, and maybe do it on a lower cost basis than what other sort of syndicators will offer themselves. You know that the managers of money and the companies out there that manage money, whether it's a Merrill Lynch or whoever, will offer that as a benefit to their clients, right? Their clients that are essentially in the capital sort of gains sort of tax-paying category. So why not have a local government join up with maybe a Merrill Lynch or some other entity that's, that has access to those taxpayers and create your own fund, rather than sitting back and reacting, right?
Absolutely, good feedback, thank you. Brian, when you look at, you made some earlier comments regarding it's very difficult, it's so complex, the process. If you could change something to make the process better, what would it be?
You know, it's really about everything that I look at is through the lens of the small guy, the small developer. You know, we do, like I said, I loan money to people that do house flips and 2 to 20 unit projects primarily, and that's what I develop on my development side. And so, you know, to encourage you know, smaller folks to come in and really do cool projects in areas of need, it needs to be very simple and straightforward. You know, most of the folks that I'm dealing with, and even myself, you know, having 5 layers of capital in deals, it's too much. It's too hard, right? So people say, you know, I had somebody come into my office and talk to me about doing a tax credit deal, and I went through it and they put it on the whiteboard, and I thought, this is so damn complex. I don't want to do this. I mean, let me do something more simple, right? And you know, again, I'm a lawyer, and, you know, I should be able to understand it, but, you know, it ought not to be so simple. I mean, it's so complex, it ought to be simple. And so it's really important, obviously. And so the message to government for me is to get more money in, you know, simplify it, make it easy, have more programs like the program that DCHFA is doing with Harvey. I mean, that's a great, great program, you know, and you've seen what small buildings have done west of the river to help change neighborhoods. You know, some like it, some don't like it, but a lot of beautiful housing stock's been built. And frankly, the same types of buildings, the townhouses that Harvey built, I walked them with him, and it's the same stuff that he's building on the other side of the river, right? Absolutely. And so it's beautiful product, it's workforce housing, but it's too complex. And you know why I can't go into more detail? Because I don't understand the details well enough to go into them, right? Because all the various tax credit programs are too complex. So that's kind of my message.
Gotcha. And has it been officially branded the East End? No? All right, it's coming. Something's coming. So let me ask you, Jim, as a nonprofit developer, if you could wave your magic wand and make the process smoother, things you could change, what would you change as a nonprofit developer?
So actually, I think we've made a lot of positive change in the last 4, 5, 6 years, and the district funds are now coming out in consolidated RFPs, and you can apply for more than one source at a time. Our underwriting processes are moving faster and are more reliable than they used to be. So as a DC-minded guy, I want to give thanks for the progress that has been made. I think one of the things that a Jubilee view of the world, I just throw in a perspective and then tell you why. Some of you may know the economist Raj Chetty, who is now at Stanford, did a lot of work at Harvard and followed the housing choice voucher and its impact on communities. His work has demonstrated that the single most predictive element of future success for a family is housing in high cost value, the other benefits of a neighborhood that's already thriving. Good schools, good grocery stores, transportation, proximity to jobs, all the things that each and every one of us need. So it's a message that I think our local government is well aware of and is working hard to incentivize, but we just need to decide that whatever it costs, we can do it and we will do it. To make that sort of resource pot just a little richer, education is one of the most important things for helping families overcome economic hardship sort of generationally. So I've had a wish list for a while that our consolidated RFP process would bring education dollars into the mix so that nonprofits that offer early childhood development centers on site or after-school programs on site or college access opportunities within the housing community, that when the developer is drawing up that pro forma and looking how to make it work, that those dollars are in the mix as well. And I think if we could center more investments on educational support alongside the housing investment, we'd be getting a double benefit.
Can I jump in? I think that's applause worthy, right? I mean, what's more important than educating our populace? You know, I mean, we really need more money, you know, to educate our children, and I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, it's a critical issue. Education, housing, and health, right? I mean, it's all intertwined, so that's a great point. Thanks for bringing that up.
Carl, I just wanted to add, with the Housing Authority itself, we are able to offer some subsidy to developers that are out there looking for an opportunity. It would be a ACC subsidy or something to that effect, maybe a project base that we might have in our funding coffers. But that would be able to support a particular project. I know ACC subsidy isn't always what everyone is always looking for, but we have it on the table, and we're willing to give it away if there's a taker out there.
So the last question before we'll open it up for questions from the audience is, are there any factors, we've talked about a number of things, but are there any factors that we haven't, you know, sort of dialogued about at this point that should be put out for discussion and it needs to be elevated as a part of the conversation?
The Community Reinvestment Act is up for modernization right now, and I know that the director of the OCC has promulgated a few, you know, proposed rules out there, and the FDIC and the Federal Reserve are stepping back right now, so they're not promoting it together. I won't offer, and I cannot offer an opinion on what's been promoted thus far with the OCC, but I can say that since the CRA was passed in '77, that not only has there just been a tremendous growth in capital from financial institutions, but also going back to this intellectual capital, which is extraordinarily important. There's been, since 1977, the development of institutions and infrastructure and smart people like yourself, Carl, and others in the private sector that, but for CRA, may not have occurred. All right. So just understand that whatever new rules are being promoted, make sure that those rules don't thwart or undermine the fact that we need to continue to build upon the establishment of institutions. Making it easier may thwart the efforts to bring more smart people into the industry. And that's important, having smart people, smart, reliable institutions to solve a really very complex problem. It's not a simple problem, is critical. So I wanted to throw that out there.
Anybody else?
Would just reinforce that, you know, when we face extraordinary challenges, we also have extraordinary opportunities. And I think this is such a pivotal time for our city and our region. It doesn't get said enough, I think, in settings like this, that we already have a remarkably strong network in industry. Our agency partners here, DHCD, HFA, Housing Authority, others if I'm missing you, have all stepped up their game significantly in recent years. We work better together The local lending community gets the district, gets the product types and the challenges that we face in the projects. So we need to recognize that we've built this remarkable potential that has an opportunity to take a next step. And if we could lever up the investment, I love it when Ed says 1 billion. Let's get to 1 billion quickly, because we have the capacity to utilize it and to make our city different. And so we need to appreciate what we have, but not at the expense of losing hunger to have more and do it better.
Carl, as you go to questions, to Q&A, which I know you promised, we're going to need to limit it to 2 relatively short answer questions. But it doesn't mean you don't ask your questions. Get them in the hallway, corner them, share, etc. So, Carl, and we have a mic that Eddie will help us with. Thank you.
All right, so with that, we'll go to, who's got a question?
Hi, I'm Sylvana Straw with the Greater Washington Community Foundation, and one issue that we hear about every time we have this conversation for the past 10 years is the lack of capacity of nonprofit developers. So my question is, if that is one of the key challenges, why isn't the public and private sector investing in the capacity of nonprofit developers? And 2, what type of investment is needed?
I can jump in real quick. I know that the Housing Authority, DC Housing Authority, has invested through new markets with Bread for the City as an example of a nonprofit entity attempting to create affordable housing in a mixed-use property. So, although limited, we are trying.
And I believe, and I know Director Donaldson is here, but I know DHCD rolled out a fund recently that's also about capacity.
The Ornamenta Newsom Fund was
Yes.
created specifically to help nonprofit developers be able to have a jump start on their proposals with pre-development and other capacity support, and that's readily available. We're doing that together with HFA, and so I invite you as nonprofit developers to support or to apply and take advantage of that resource.
Can I respond to Savannah? And Savannah, the check's in the mail. What a great question. To me, the biggest thing, and I see Ellen at Mikasa right over here and others in the room, Fernando, we need talent. We need to be able to pay for talent over time. And, you know, our model, we're fortunate to get committed people who have lived great lives and want to make the city better, but they don't come knowing the alphabet soup of low-income housing tax credits. And the kinds of sophisticated tools that we have to play with now to do this work require a level of talent that in my nonprofit we can't afford. And so I would like to ask the foundation community, the philanthropic community, to help us invest in talent over time, help us close the gap on the salaries that we pay to market, help us build other incentives that attract young talent and help us retain it. I think that would be the biggest thing from Jubilee's perspective.
Very important. So this will be the last, final quick question, if there is one.
All right, so it sounds like we're good for the moment. Remember the hallway crush. First of all, I think the answer is unrestricted equity for the nonprofits. That's what allows them, I just want to be, you know, real plain, right? That's what it is, unrestricted equity, and that will allow them to build their teams and to build the capacity that you are looking to see. Let's thank this amazing panel, but hold on, don't go anywhere. Let's thank them first. Thank you all very, very much. They did a magnificent job, and one of the things we do is try and capture some of these ideas, and which we will do, and circulate it out. I mean, I heard some really very direct action items of things that could be done, and so thank you all for both your forward preparation and your intellect to be able to offer those to us as a group. That's exactly why we are here. Couple quick things. Twitter is not down yet, so you can keep tweeting. I'll remind you, they're individual handles if you want to attribute a comment to them. It's in the program. Also use hashtag #CityFirst if you don't mind. I also want to mention one of our additional colleagues, Director Bowman Keaty is in the room, in the house, so we're going to definitely give him a shout out. You all probably know pretty well. He's very, very active in this space. He's also, as I guess I gave a shout out to Marie earlier about being our rising chair, I suspect Bo may be our rising vice chair, so thank you for being here. And hopefully I'm not forcing you to accept that in public right here. We also have, when you go outside, you'll see a beautiful portrait of Lloyd Smith, who was one of our founders, and his grandson, Tadani, who is a noted and incredibly talented artist, painted that. And so check it out, and then check out the rest of his amazing work. Go to his webpage. It's really quite, he's extremely talented and just very real. Obviously, it's impossible to cover affordable housing in a morning. But I have to tell you, I think what we receive, certainly what I receive from all of our panelists and participants, is phenomenal. And again, just don't let it stop with this. Carry it into the hallways, carry it back to your workplace. Hopefully you have been revved up, charged, where you're going back and, you know, folks, your staff's gonna be scared, right? Because, you know, what are the 5 ideas that you're coming back with? I also just wanna make sure, because this is important, I think, at City First and how we look at our city, and it was alluded to, know that the disparities that we talk about around economics directly overlay with the racial disparities in our city. And it's very important to put that front and center and think about that as we're trying to create a more just society. That's a priority for us, and I'll leave that as a reminder for you. Today, which is not over, I do want, while we're on the stage, to be able to thank a few people who have just done an amazing job in bringing this to you. I will thank Carl as moderator. These are City Firsters, of course. Gloria Nodden, Cynthia Newell, Eugene, who's fixing the AV in the back as needed, Catherine Harper. These folks, I know they were up at like 3 in the morning, and that was not yet done. They were still going and have worked very hard to be able to bring this to you, and all on behalf of City First Foundation. I also want to thank our participants, specifically Marie Johns, Polly Donaldson, Chris Miller, our stage here. And later in the afternoon, again, remember, we're going to have Ben Miller, Ginger Rumpf, Kiva Davis, and Allison Hickman. The sponsors are on the back of your program. And the last thing I'll tie into is, as I mentioned, this is the second of 2 events. We will be celebrating our 25th year this year. And so we're very excited to be hard at this work and still around, pushing 25 years later. And so our last Impact Forum will focus on both a look back, not a collective look back of 25 years, but more importantly, a look forward. That's going to be December 7th at the Halcyon House, which is something you also need to know about. Very, very important organization in the city that's got very good funding and very, very bright ideas around equity. And we'll probably do that from late afternoon 4 to into the evening. We'll have panel discussions. We'll also have reception and some awardees. So I want to definitely, invitations, not checks in the mail, but invitations are in the mail there as well. So here's what we're going to do now. We're going to get out in the hallway and continue our Q&A. It was kind of loud when I walked out there to get a water, and people will grab you, and you'll have a good chance to interact with folks. We're going to do that. We are going to have the breakout sessions. They'll be at 12:30, and they'll be in 3 different locations. We'll do one right here. Oh, here we go. I'm in the way. We'll do one here around opportunity zones in this room. Ginger will go to the Hunt floor, gallery down, 2 doors down, and then Allison will do public-private partnerships downstairs. So we hope to see you there. And while we're here, let's thank all the folks who I mentioned earlier who are involved, and thank you as well for being here.